we've got two extraordinary scientific entrepreneurs with us today, two of the absolute greatest in the country. And you've read something about each of them. Joe DeSimone, most of you have seen or have heard of or know he's here in Chapel Hill. Joe is a chemical engineer and a chemist, and he has started multiple companies, and you've read about those. His most recent company here in the RTP is called Liquidia, and they make nanoparticles for use mostly in medicine, but probably some other things, and they're made out of plastic. And you all remember you saw something about plastics in my lecture. Do you remember? We showed him the scene from The Graduate. Yeah.
Did you show him the follow-up in Star Trek?
No.
Where Scotty needed to have a material for bringing the whales back.
Yeah.
And it was, and he used polycarbonate, and the guy said, "So you're still using plastics?" He wanted transparent aluminum.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
Y'all can laugh, you know, that's funny. Okay. Also, we're just thrilled to have with us Bob Langer. You read the case, the Harvard case about Bob's lab. He is the David Koch Institute professor at MIT. He's published 1,175 articles. His patents have been licensed to 250 pharmaceutical, chemical, biotechnology, and medical device companies. And he has been named one of the 100 most important people in America and one of the 18 top people in science or medicine by Time Magazine and CNN and lots of other things. But what I've always admired about Bob is, you know, he's been here to Chapel Hill to talk to students. I don't know, this is the third or fourth time. He's very generous with his time despite of his accomplishments. And the thing I remember, the first time Bob came to Chapel Hill that I remember was maybe 10 years ago, and he gave a lecture in the chemistry department, and he was talking about all the different things that he's invented. And somebody asked him, and I may be stealing part of his talk, but he said, they said, "Why did you do all this stuff? And you know, what was the most important experience?" And he said, "Working as an orderly in a hospital," which I think is unbelievably good advice for young people coming up in this area. So let's give a warm welcome to Joe DeSimone and Bob Langer. So we wanted to start off by sort of just giving you guys each a little bit of time to tell everybody sort of how you got here. They're hearing a lot of sort of life journeys of people, and you know, we want to save a lot of time for discussion, but if you could each sort of just 10 minutes about, 5 to 10 minutes about kind of how you got here and things that they can pick up on for themselves about that.
Well, first of all, thanks for including us, Holden and Buck. So I grew up in Pennsylvania. I went to a small liberal arts residential college called Ursinus College. Had about 1,200 students, and it was, so you knew everything that happened on the weekend. And it was a terrific liberal arts experience, being a chemistry major and a couple different minors in different aspects of mathematics. And then married my high school sweetheart right after graduating college, and then went down to Blacksburg, Virginia for graduate school at Virginia Tech. So we have a big football game this weekend, and I'm going to be divided. And then went to graduate school for Virginia Tech and learned about polymer chemistry, plastics, as Holden was referring to them, and decided I wanted to focus on that when I was an undergraduate. Because at Ursinus, we actually had a class in polymer chemistry, which was one of the few undergraduate schools on the East Coast that taught polymers. And what I liked most about it was it's a very utilitarian-like field, in that you could see the consequences of what you were doing, and it actually, materials is very tangible, and that you can make an impact on with that. And so I decided to study that in graduate school. I like the applied aspects of it. Went to Virginia Tech for graduate school, and graduated when I was 25 and was hired here as an assistant professor in 1990 when I was 25. And all I had to do at that point was to teach polymers and organic chemistry, which was pretty fun. And rose up through the ranks. My first PhD student, Dr. Valerie Shears Ashby, is now chair of the chemistry department. So note to self, be kind to your graduate students. You never know when they're going to be your boss. And Valerie's my boss. Started my program in green chemistry. So that's doing environmentally friendly things, environmentally friendly ways to make plastics, and partnered with DuPont, and DuPont licensed our technology for making Teflon in environmentally friendly ways and built a big plant in Fayetteville, North Carolina. And then started moving into life sciences back in the early 2000s, and actually partnered with Bob, and we developed a medical device company that developed a bioabsorbable stent, a stent that goes away. So stents are used after angioplasty to keep blood vessels open. So we decided to make a stent out of a plastic that would degrade just like a bioabsorbable suture. And to make a long story short, that company was bought out by another company called Guidant. It's now part of Abbott. And we have about 1,000 people with our bioabsorbable stents in them. We just got the FDA equivalent approval in Europe. And so that started me moving in materials into life sciences. I like the applications of helping on human disease and prevention. And started applying our craft of polymer science into making nanoparticles and using some of the techniques from the computer industry to make better nano and microparticles. And we launched a company called Liquidia that's got about 60 employees now in Research Triangle Park. We've raised about $60 million, and the last $10 million of which was the first equity investment ever by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And that came after a conversation with Bill that I'd be happy to tell you about later if it makes sense. I run a research group, about 40 here, half postdocs, half grad students, and a talented group of undergraduates as part of that as well. And I also now have an appointment in the business school at something called the Keene Institute of Private Enterprise, which is trying to facilitate entrepreneurial activities on campus and in the region.
So, Joe, one question.
Yeah.
How did that interview process go here at UNC when you were, did you fit right into the chemistry department?
You know, so Buck, when I walked in, and I started a year or two before Holden did here, you know, I didn't know traditional chemistry departments, and had I known who was sitting around the table, I probably would have been a hell of a lot more nervous than I was. I didn't know any of them, and it was really it was a top chemistry department, and I should have been nervous, and I wasn't because I didn't know better. And I just talked about what it is we wanted to do, and a man named Ed Samolsky was starting a polymer program, and he sort of guided me through the process, and they took a big risk on hiring somebody who didn't do a postdoc. And here I am today, 22 years later.
Right. Bob?
Yeah. So, well, for me, I grew up in Albany, New York, and I went to Cornell University and majored in chemical engineering. I'd like to say I really had thought it out carefully. I really didn't. I actually in high school, I still remember somebody, you know, asked me what engineering was. I really thought engineers ran railroad cars. And I just didn't know what it was, but people said if you're good in math and science, you go into engineering, so that's what I did. And my first year at Cornell, the only subject that I did okay in was chemistry, and so I figured I have to be a chemical engineer. But when I got done, you know, there were a couple of jobs. I did apply for a couple of jobs, and I got a couple of job offers running chemical plants, which would have been a disaster. I would have been terrible at it. And so I thought probably the best thing is to go to graduate school. I went to graduate school at MIT, and I really wasn't that excited about the research that I did. I actually spent most of the time when I was a graduate student starting a school for poor kids in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and I liked that. And I developed new chemistry curricula and things like that. And so when I got done, though, this was the timing in history. This was 1974, and there was kind of like this gas shortage, supposedly, like there was a couple of years ago. So all these oil companies had all these jobs, and every one of my classmates, that's what they did. They got hired by oil companies, and I figured that's what I should probably do too. I just, was going along for stuff. And so I applied to oil companies and I got 20 job offers. That wasn't even an achievement, it's just that they had the job. And I remember four jobs from Exxon alone. And one of them actually made quite an impression on me. I remember going to Exxon in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and one of the engineers said to me, if you could just increase the yield of this one petrochemical by 0.1%, he said, that would be fantastic. He said, it'd be worth billions of dollars. And I remember flying back to Boston that night thinking to myself that I really don't want to do that. I just felt that was boring. What impact are you going to make by, even if it's money, by increasing something by 0.1%? So then I felt I wasn't going to go down that road. In fact, I always tell my students that the interviews were very helpful, not just in showing me what you did want to do, but in showing you what you didn't want to do. So then what I did is I saw an ad one day to develop chemistry curricula, be an assistant professor at City College of New York. And since that's what I did at helping start that high school, I wrote them a letter, but they didn't write me back. But I liked the idea, so I found all of the places in the country that might hire somebody to be an assistant professor of chemistry education. I wrote them letters, and none of them wrote me back. So that wasn't going well either. And so I thought, well, then I was thinking of other ways that I might be able to use my chemical engineering background to help people, and I thought of medicine. So I wrote a lot of letters to medical schools and hospitals, and they didn't write back. But then one day, one of the people in the lab where I was mentioned to me, this man, the surgeon, Judah Folkman, and he said to me, he said, Bob, he said, sometimes you should write him. He said, sometimes he hires unusual people. He thought very highly of Dr. Folkman. I won't say what he thought about me. So I wrote to Dr. Folkman, and he did hire me, and he had a very different idea. He was a surgeon. He had the idea that if you could stop blood vessels from growing in the body, maybe that would be a whole new way of trying to treat cancer. And that seemed to me like amazing. I thought you could really have an impact if you could do that. But there were a lot of challenges in it, and one of those challenges was obviously finding such a substance. Nobody had ever reported that before. Second challenge was developing what we call a bioassay for it. And the bioassay that we decided to use took place in the eye of a rabbit, but it took 2 months. And so to solve that problem, we had to develop what we call a slow-release polymer that could deliver certain substances for really long times, like a couple months. And people didn't think you could do that. There was articles in the literature saying that was, not possible. But I didn't know that, and so I kept trying, and eventually I actually figured out a way to get it to work. I didn't initially understand how we got it to work, but it did work, and we could release these substances for months, years even, and that enabled us to actually find the first substance that stopped blood vessels from growing, and also to have ways of making these polymers. It's interesting, at Children's Hospital where I worked, it's probably the best hospital in the country, but they'd never had a patent. So we actually filed for the first patent in the history of Children's Hospital, and eventually it took us 7 years, we got it. And then what happened was, I'd been working on this now 8, 9, 10 years, published papers and good papers in top journals like Nature and Science, but nobody cared, nobody used it. Finally, after about 10 years, 2 different large companies, one in animal health and one in human health, asked me to be a consultant, and I told them about the patents and the work, and they decided they'd license it. And they actually gave us very large academic grants and even gave me a consulting contract. And I thought, this is great, they're going to work on it. But what happened is after a year or two, they didn't do anything. They did maybe one experiment. If the experiment didn't work, they decided to stop. And so that was very disappointing to me. Also at that time, another thing happened, that there was a company that started in Baltimore. And by the way, in the 80s, to have startup companies, it was much easier in some ways. In biotech, there was a lot of money. So this company called Nova Pharmaceuticals, they had raised about $50 million, but they didn't know what they were going to do with it. So one day I get a call from one of their vice presidents. He wanted to come up to Boston, and he said, can we license something from you? And I said, what would you like to license? And he said, well, anything. And they're going to give you a grant. And I thought, boy, this is amazing.
The old days.
So I said to him, well, eventually it occurred to me that they, wanted to write a check. So I said, well, I have a good friend in Baltimore who works at Johns Hopkins, and I'm working, and we had this idea about developing these polymers for someday treating brain cancer. I said, well, why don't you give him a grant and give me a grant, and we'll try to do this. So they did. But what was amazing to me was this little company of just 50 people, everybody just worked on this project, and they worked day and night to try to get this out. And actually, eventually, it would get approved by the FDA. And that showed me that these small companies had this passion and this drive to do these things. So the next year, some venture capitalists came to see me, and they said, would I like to start a company? And so I was able to get those patents back from the two large companies, and we started a company to make those microspheres, and that actually company did quite well. And then we just kept doing it, so I think I just felt it was enormous leverage. You could start something in a laboratory, where it was very hard to raise money, and certainly hard to raise a lot of money, but then you could start these companies where people, in fact, many times it was my own students, they'd done their thesis, postdoctoral work, and we'd start these companies, and microspheres, nanospheres, all kinds of things, new drugs, new devices. And to me, it has been a wonderful experience because those companies, they begin to change the world. And everybody works day and night, and they feel like an ownership of the company. And I think they are changing the world. So to me, that's how I started doing it. I think we've done now like about 26 different companies in all different kinds of areas.
Okay. Buck and I can ask questions, but we'll also welcome questions from you all at any time.
And also, you can type them up here. Let me lead off. Okay, let me just lead off because we have a lot of seniors in this class, and I get to talk to a lot of them, and they get a lot of phone calls from their parents, and a lot of them, the parents can't understand why they don't have their whole life planned out already, right? And because they're seniors, and what's their first job and their second job and all the rest. So I was wondering, when you guys were seniors, what did you have your life planned out or anything close to it? Or think back to your senior, this is October of your senior year.
For me, I think it's important to take a lot of different classes to find out what you don't like and find out what you do like and then what you're good at. And I think finding alignment with the things that you like to do and that you're reasonably good at is an important thing to sort of hone in on. And that was, for me, in fact, I started feeling this in high school, that I enjoyed chemistry and that I could teach it, but not knowing exactly what I wanted to do. I didn't even know graduate school that they would pay you to go to grad. I didn't know that as a senior, I found out that you could get paid to go to graduate school. That was mind-blowing to me. And my father was born in Italy, first-generation family in the United States, and I didn't realize that one could, in fact, be paid to go to graduate school.
You thought you had to pay them?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, just like tuition, right? You thought, but as a graduate student, you get paid. You don't make a lot of money, but you can survive, and they pay your tuition. And then decided to go to Virginia Tech. Now, for me, that was a big step because I went to a small liberal arts college.
In the South, after growing up in Philadelphia, right?
Coming from Philly, and that was way south for me. And so that was a big change. But it's a very big technical school, Virginia Tech. It was more of an engineering, applied science environment, so that was a big change. And so I didn't know. And even when in graduate school, I had no idea I was going to go into academics. In fact, it wasn't until very late in the process I thought I was going to be moving back to Philly, working for Roman Haas or DuPont or Arco. And then I was told about, have I ever thought about academia? And I interviewed 3 academic positions, UConn, University of Florida, and here, and I got the nod and took the position.
Bob, you were starting schools.
What's that?
You were starting schools.
Well, as a graduate student, but as a senior, it's funny that you asked that. I was thinking my daughter's a senior in college, and I
Bugging her?
Well, not by saying she's got to have a job, but it's like she tells me, well, she wants to travel around the world, and I said, well, but what are you going to do after that? And so I think it's important to think about what you want to do. I don't think you should have your whole life planned. I think actually that's a mistake. I didn't know what sometimes I'm still not sure what I want to do, and I'm 64. But I think it's good to give it some thought. It's good to have, like I say, to me, I think I agree with all the things Joe said. And I also found interviews, as I mentioned, very helpful in telling you what you do and don't want to do. You get exposed to things. So I think thinking through what you do and don't want to do is very helpful. But to have it figured out, I wasn't even close. I didn't know what I wanted to do when I was a senior In college, I didn't know what I wanted to do when I was my fourth year of doing my PhD, and I really wasn't very sure what I wanted to do after 3 years of a postdoc. It takes a long time to figure that out.
There's a really cool book out there called The Startup of You, written by the founders of LinkedIn. So it's a little bit of a commercial for LinkedIn, but it talks about being in a permanent set of beta, like a beta version of software, where you're constantly in dynamic, sort of mode and learning new things. And they have a really great line in there that finished is an F word. I mean, you should be always thinking about, being in always dynamic and changing. Good book, good read.
Okay, I had somebody right here.
Dr. Meyer, can you speak more about your experiences in starting a school for students in terms of like mobilizing your resources as only a graduate student, and also how sustainable was your curriculum that you developed?
Yeah, well, we tried to do this, actually it's interesting, Cambridge, which is where MIT and Harvard are. It's funny, you'd think that would be one of the most well-off or best places in the country. Turns out that when I was a graduate student, they had a 35, a lot of poor parts of Cambridge, there was 35% dropout rate. In fact, I think for a city its size, it had the highest dropout rate in the United States for high school. And a lot of drug problems and so forth. In fact, and actually it was an interesting lesson for me. So I went there originally because some people called me up and they'd heard I'd done some good, before that I'd done some tutoring in math and science, and some other people that were thinking about starting it up called me up, said, could I help on the math and science? And so I did. But you shortly realize that when you do this, that you have to help on everything. You have to help on raising money and so forth. And so we did. We looked at unusual places. In fact, it's kind of funny. Since I was at MIT, I thought, well, MIT has different parts of MIT that maybe I could get MIT to give them some money. And I think I got money out of 17 different places of MIT. Provost's office, they had a community service fund. I thought of all different ways to do that. And then I also helped on grants, MIT, the school, a lot of the kids dropped out because of drug problems, and we wrote grants to like NIDA, National Institute of Drug Abuse, saying how we could stop that or help it by, having the kids in school and things like that. So we raised quite a bit of money to do these things, but it was a very liberal kind of. Cambridge in the early 70s was a very liberal kind of place. So it's funny. Like even though I was teaching math and science, the rule at the school was that people didn't have to take it. You didn't have to take math. And you didn't have to take science. And so I had to work hard to make it interesting. I spent a lot of time, which was good. So and I was always very proud of the fact. I remember the first year I came, there were 35 students and 4 signed up for math. The second year there were 50 students and 45 signed up for math. So so that was very important to me. So it ended up winning all kinds of awards, and I think actually had a transformative effect on people's lives. In fact, it's amazing when I think back, many of the people who were in that school dropped out of high school. I also set up a labs program at MIT for kids to work there. But the story I was going to tell was, I remember about 11 years ago, they asked me to give the speech to the incoming freshman class. And after I gave that speech, I remember there was a young man who came up to me. He was 18 years old. He was from Alaska, and he said, his father said to please say hi to him. He said, because he was at that school and took my class and worked actually in our lab and ended up being very successful. It's kind of amazing to me to see the kids that had, were basically dropouts, and then see their kids go to places like MIT. So it was a great experience for me. I also think that, and it never occurred to me, but that going, like when you're an academic today, raising, and even with the companies, raising money is something that any professor has to do, and when you're in companies you have to do. And that experience of trying to raise money for a school like that probably helped me in ways I never expected, because I learned how people could say no all the time, and you just keep struggling and fighting. And I think it probably had a transformative effect on my life, even though that was never my intention.
So there's some questions right behind us up here.
Which, you want to go from the top?
Sure.
Which is the Langer article? So,
It's the Harvard Business.
the Harvard Business one.
Yeah.
Sure. Well, what I think I said in that, I should reread the article, but
It's a good article. Not as good as our book, but it's good.
no, the book is great. But so anyhow, I think what I said is the following. And when we've done companies, usually I like to have what I call as a platform technology. And again, I'm applying this to the medical area. You might have different criteria if it's not medical. But I like to have like what I'll call a platform technology, which means if I have like I said, one of those microspheres, that's a platform technology because you could put drug, and Joe's doing the same, you could put drug A in it, drug B in it, drug C in it. That's why he was saying, he's got, different arrangements for like vaccines, cancer, inhalation. So that's a platform technology. That would be the first thing. If I just had a technology for just one thing, I might not do a company. Maybe I might license that to somebody. But if you have a platform technology, what my experience is, if you don't develop it through a company, a lot of it's not going to get used because company X might just buy it and then use it for one thing, not 40 or 50 or whatever number of things it might have the potential for. Second thing is I like it to be a transformative thing, something that could change the world, could be a big deal and probably be published in a really top journal like, say, Science or Nature. I also like to have a really good patent behind it or a set of patents behind it. And again, since it's in medicine, I like to have at least good animal data showing that there's a reasonable probability it might work. If we're only at like test tubes, the distance, because everything in medicine just takes so many years. Investors are going to get tired if it takes you 20 years to get into a patient. And finally, pretty much every time we've done it, it's been with my students or postdocs. And they have like the passion to take the things they worked on for their thesis or postdoc and do it at the company and really take the next step to go from just the discovery or invention they made in the lab to real products that can help save human lives. So to me, or help human lives. So to me, those would be the elements.
If I take the failures question.
Yeah.
I could do that too.
One of the things we did early in my career was we tried to use carbon dioxide as a solvent. So we're all exhaling CO2 here, and that's a gas. But if you pressurize a gas, you can turn it to a liquid. And it looks like any other liquid, just in a closed container, and it could be at room temperature. And it looks like water. And you all know about CO2 in solid form. That's dry ice. Right, so those are three states of CO2. Well, we were using that liquid form of CO2 as an organic solvent to make plastics in. And I had some students that were interested in using that CO2 as a cleaning solvent so that you could do, just like dry ice, to do dry cleaning in a liquid. And so many of you are familiar with dry cleaning. How many people have ever been in the back of a dry cleaning plant? Anybody? A couple. So it uses an organic solvent. So dry cleaning is cleaning in a liquid that's not water. And so you can imagine cleaning clothes in things like gasoline, organic solvents. But the problem is when you clean clothes or rags in gasoline, you go to dry them, what happens? Flammability issues, right? So in the 30s, people realized that if you would chlorinate cousins to gasoline, they would not be flammable. They would be safer. But the problem is chlorinated organic solvents are toxins, and they get in groundwater, and it's a problem in a lot of dry cleaning places. But that's what you're dry cleaning clothes in a chlorinated organic solvent. And so we thought that we could clean in carbon dioxide as a replacement to perchloroethylene and these chlorinated solvents. And so we launched a company focused on dry cleaning and CO2. And that means we had to build machines, new dry cleaning machines, and the soaps for it, and the technology was working great. And then we decided to roll it out, and we decided to roll it out as a franchise. So all of a sudden, here's a chemistry professor that was interested in the process, and now we're building machines, and now we're building out a franchise. And we were rolling out a new dry cleaning solvent. And a real important lesson learned is there's something called a CAGR, which I thought was a party at the time, is a compounded annual growth rate. And a compounded annual growth rate, dry cleaning was declining. And to introduce a new technology that was more expensive in a declining industry is not a smart thing to do. Our technology was more expensive, even though it was more environmentally friendly, but nobody was willing to pay a premium even though it was more environmentally friendly. So our lesson learned that even though environmentally sustainable was of interest to a lot of people, if it's not cheaper or at the same cost, few people are going to do it. And so we started rolling this out, and then we had financing challenges, but we had 70 dry cleaners open around the country in places like Madison, Wisconsin, and Wilmington, North Carolina, called Hangers Cleaners, and San Diego. In fact, they're still running out in a lot of places. But we went to go do a financing, and I'll never forget it. It was Monday morning, September 10th, 2001. And we had a really great financing meeting. I boarded an airplane for Denver, and the next morning the world changed with 9/11. And all venture capital dried up that night. And we had a company of 50 employees, and we were venture financed, and we were growing, but we couldn't get through that period, and we didn't roll out fast enough, and we didn't treat cash as king, and we got caught by that event, and the company ended up, even though technologically it was a success, commercially it wasn't, and it was a lot of lessons learned there.
This is the third time they've heard the 9/11 financing story.
Is that right?
Yeah.
3 of our guests
Yeah.
had the same experience.
Wow.
You're the third guest, right? One was Holden.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
wow.
I think we cried together somewhere.
Okay.
So when we tell you that you will fail at some point, that's the only thing we can really guarantee you. If you do this entrepreneurship, you're going to have one of these experiences like Joe and Holden. And
Included, it's my party, and I'll cry if I want to in the song.
Bob, you had a failure too you wanted to tell them about.
Well, I mean, I've had many. I'm just trying to think which is the worst one or best one. You know, I think you can break them down into a couple areas. I mean, there's scientific failures. I mean, along the lines that Joe said, I mean, sometimes you make discoveries. Like I had this idea once that you could use enzymes to remove things from the body that are bad. And one of the ideas I had was removing bilirubin. We did that. We actually published a paper in a very good journal, got some patents on it. But then in the meantime, not unlike what Joe's saying, you know, people came out with an idea of doing the same thing by light, which is much safer and much easier. So that didn't go anywhere. And I've had many experiences like that where we've come up with ideas that I thought were good. Sometimes they actually turn around. I mean, and I'll give you another example along the same lines. I mean, so they might start out as a failure. And I would say that Joe's thing, since I know some of the story, I don't know if that's even a failure, because they even did, now they're actually using the processes that Joe developed to try to make new kinds of stents and things like that. So I don't know if that's because science is complicated. So much of when you think about a failure, and I think this is important for anybody that looks at it, is like it really is in the eye of the beholder, because it's not so simple that it's an absolute failure, because sometimes you learn things, but sometimes some of the science that you develop can go in different directions. So the second failure I'll give you also was an enzyme idea I had. I also had this idea of using heparin to remove things from the bloodstream. And so we did that also. There was another paper in a very good journal. Both of them actually were in Science. But in the course of that, we also cloned a whole bunch of enzymes to do this. We purified them and so forth. So I always wanted to use these enzymes to remove heparin from the body. And we actually did license it to a company, and they actually took it to what's called a phase 3 trial. And then they ran into some safety issues, so they never took it forward. So that was certainly a failure. But again, depending how you look at it, since we developed those enzymes, a couple of my students and I, we realized that we could use those enzymes for the first time to sequence polysaccharides like heparin or glycoproteins. So we actually started a company called Momenta, and basically to do just that. And that company actually, one of the things they did is they actually ended up with the largest syringe launch in history. They sold over $1 billion of product, you know, in their first year after FDA approval, because they had this ability to sequence certain types of drugs. So much depends on, and it may turn out that Joe's thing may turn out with a fantastic class of stents. You just don't know. I mean, because science sometimes, you know, when you make a finding, it can go in all different directions.
Okay, if you could highlight the most important step you took in your career, what would you choose?
You know, I think moving into new fields. You know, when we did the CO2 activity, my lab was completely focused on CO2. We were well funded. I was co-director of a $40 million center from the National Science Foundation that we landed, and we got the grant in 1999. And in 2000, it was supposed to be a 10-year grant, but in 2005, I decided to switch fields and move into life sciences. And so it's really hard to contemplate, you know, switching completely into new fields. I didn't even have much biology, and I was gonna immerse myself into an entirely new field, and I was gonna stop taking the ample funding that was flowing, and I was gonna go get new funding at NIH, which I'd never written an NIH grant before. So that was a big risk, and especially when you have funding and you're comfortable. And moving into a new field was the biggest risk I think we've taken.
I agree with that. I mean, I went through my kind of, for me, the biggest step, and it certainly was just what Joe said, is changing fields. Like I said, I was a chemical engineer my whole life, and then I decided to work in a surgery department in a hospital. And actually, I was the only person in the entire hospital who was an engineer. So it was a huge risk, and you know, it was a huge change in my field. But by doing it, it, you know, changed my life. It gave me, and in fact, I felt like almost like a kid in a candy store. I'd learned chemical engineering, and then I went into this hospital, and I could see all these medical problems, and biologists and clinicians were always trying to solve them the same way. And since I was a chemical engineer, I didn't have the same perspective, so I sometimes looked at it in different ways. And I think changing fields like that ended up being a transformative experience for me.
Let's take that first question on nano. So what's going on in nanotechnology? So, you know, one of the things our company is doing, our laboratory is doing, is we're trying to apply the manufacturing techniques from the computer industry used to make transistors and applying that to making new medicines and vaccines. And so we're bridging microelectronics fabrication techniques. We're able to scale it up using the roll-to-roll film techniques from the old photographic industry. We have a lot of Polaroid people working for us now, and we're applying it to making new vaccines and new medicines. And so the opportunity for precisely engineering particle size and shape allows us to, in a very specific way, tickle the immune system and design better vaccines. And I had mentioned that about Bill Gates, interesting story. I knew I was going to see Bill Gates at this conference, and I knew months ahead of time I was going to see Bill. And you know, you sort of think about, I was going to be introduced to him, you sort of think about, what are you going to say to Bill Gates to get his attention? And I knew I was going to have like 10 seconds. So I thought long and hard about it, and I got to meet him, and they said, Bill, this is Joe, and you know, Joe, this is Bill, and I said, I know who it is. Right? And Bill says, what do you do? And I said, Bill, we're using the manufacturing tools of the computer industry to make better vaccines. And so that was a direct technical link between Microsoft and the Gates Foundation. And there was always a link between the two, but it was always financial, not technical. And so that conversation turned into a 20 or 30-minute conversation. And it culminated in the first equity investment ever by the Gates Foundation and our company, Liquidia. So the foundation is an equity owner. It's a part owner of our company. And what that allows us to do is to guarantee access of our nanotechnology for developing vaccines for the developing world alongside of vaccines for the developed world. And we have new products that are emerging in that area. And we've got vaccines for influenza. We've got really terrific data for malaria. And we're working on and some really strong preliminary data in dengue. which is a proliferating disease now. So we're really interested in developing these kinds of vaccines using nanotechnology.
So stop 1 second. So who knows what an elevator pitch is? Okay. So Joe, say one more time, and you should probably write this down because you're going to have to do an elevator pitch, and if you want an example of a really good one, Joe should say it slowly again. You should probably write it down because it's as good an elevator pitch as I've ever heard.
Yeah, so we're using the manufacturing tools of the computer industry to make better vaccines in a really crisp way of describing.
So that's it. It was like 10 words, right? So we try to say it's 2 or 3 minutes. Joe got it down to about 10 words. And
10 words is even better.
yeah.
And you had a great elevator pitch last night about what MIT does really, really well.
You have to remind me what I said.
About research. Yeah, I mean, the undergraduate
Oh, well,
experience.
yeah. So actually, I was just going to make a statement on Joe's thing, and then I'll answer that. So actually, I think the other thing that Joe did, which is very important on the elevator pitch, is he understood his audience. And because that elevator pitch wouldn't necessarily work perfectly for a lot of people, but it's absolutely the right elevator pitch for Bill Gates in many ways. Anyhow, what MIT, so they were asking me last night about MIT and some of the unique features, and one of the things that I mentioned is that really one of MIT's great strengths is the undergraduate research program, that people, when they're freshmen or sophomores, I mean, any year, but I'd say almost everybody at MIT does undergraduate research. And I think that if you want to do research as part of your career, that's been a wonderful experience. I mean, and I see the students there, day and night. I still remember when I was a assistant professor, I always had this policy of before I'd stop home, I would stop in the lab and pick up my mail and stuff like that to answer it. And one day, because I flew back from New Jersey and the plane decided it was foggy in Boston, and so by the time I got to Boston, I decided I needed to fly back to New Jersey. So I ended up taking a bus from New Jersey to Boston, and I got in at 3 in the morning. I stopped in the lab, 3:30, and the place is hopping. Oh, there must have been 15 undergraduates there, and they're just loving it and having a great time and working hard. But I think that that experience has been transformative for a lot of the people that want to do research there.
And it's not just in the sciences too. I mean, across the entire liberal arts education, I strongly encourage everyone here to be participating in research and independent study. That is one of the most rewarding and one of the most distinguishing characteristics I think you can have as you start preparing for life beyond Carolina.
And I'll give you the elevator pitch for that. I think what higher education needs is exactly what Bob just described, and that is that undergraduates should come to campus even on days they don't have class. Right, so if you're having a research experience like Bob described, or you're part of student government, or you're doing social entrepreneurship, or whatever it is, even if you live off campus, on a day when you don't have class, you're still going to come here. And the performing arts have done that, and science has done that, and that's what higher education needs, because those create the experiences that all of us have carried out to do the various things that we've done. So there are a lot of first-year students in here. 2 years from now, when you're living on campus, I hope you live on campus all 4 years, but if you don't, then my advice is that you have a college experience that brings you to campus every day, even when you don't have class. It's just a simple rubric.
Question?
Both of y'all's formal educations have mostly been technical in the sciences, and for instance, in y'all's case, when you started these businesses, have you kind of learned as you go for the business stuff, or have you hired consultants in the business field? How has that worked for y'all?
You learn as you go, and you make a lot of mistakes as you go. In my first, so the first technology was a license to an existing company, DuPont. And we learned a lot about the licensing and doing applied research. And you make mistakes on that license agreement. You make mistakes when you file those patents and you look to strengthen them. And then as you start, we started MyCell Technologies and we did licensing, and at one point I was even chairman of the board of directors. And that was an amazing experience. I had some really brutal board members so brutal that there's nothing that I can do that would be more challenging. I am totally ready for anything, just because how damn challenging that board meetings were at times. And that's, you know, those are experiences that you learn from.
They call you names and stuff, right?
Oh, they dropped the F-bomb. I mean, it was brutal. I mean, that's not healthy, but you learn from those experiences. But Liquidia, we've got a terrific board. I realize I'm a good board member. It's not best for me being chairman of a board. I think the biggest lesson learned for me is, and I think you can judge anybody by this, is who they hire. You can look at anybody and judge them by who they hire. I'm proud of the people that I've been able to hire and associate myself with, and I think that's a true hallmark feature of anybody's leadership skills, is who they're able to hire.
Okay.
We've got, let's see, we've got a bunch of them up here. Someone wants to know about product names.
There
Where'd
you
you
go.
find Liquidia?
So our technology for making particles we call PRINT, which stands for Particle Replication and Non-Wetting Templates. But before we called it PRINT, we called it, the actual more technical, we called it Non-Wetting Imprint Lithography, and the acronym for that is NO-WIL. And we were about to publish a paper and use this acronym called NO-WIL. And I told my students, I said, that's not a good name. I think it was important what we were doing, but we got to find a new name. And they came in the next day as we're about to send out the paper, and they said, let's call it, what about print? And I said, I don't care what it stood for, we're going to use it. Because print, connotates something a lot more appropriate, because we're printing particles in some way, than NO-WIL. NO-WIL would not have been good. But Liquidia, we're using a liquid polymer, liquid Teflon, and we're looking for liquids and materials, and I had an undergraduate, and we had a list of Latin names that were liquid related, or material, materia. We tried to make it sound Latin, and so we called it Liquidia, and we trademarked it, and I think it's been useful for the company to have that name.
Yeah, I'll give you one also. So a number of years ago, I had a postdoc in my lab named David Edwards, and he and I came up with this idea of a new kind of aerosol. Right now, when you give aerosol, or certainly then when you gave aerosols to patients, it's amazing. Like, you get maybe 2% of the aerosol into the lung. But we came up with a particular design, and we published it in Science, the journal Science, and we patented it, of an aerosol that was very porous, kind of like looking like a wiffle ball. And the way we designed it, we could actually now get up to 70% in the lung. And what that meant was that you could then, it opened the door to giving new kinds of drugs that right now you'd have to have this giant canister to give, but if with the aerosol being 35 times better, you could have a tiny one. So, and that ended up being a very successful company. The IRR for that was, I think, about 1,200%, which is the annualized return. I think it was the highest for any medical company ever. But just to go back to the name, what happened was, so then, like now we do computers and stuff. This was 1997. So David was a postdoc with me, and then he started being an associate professor at Penn State. So what I would always do at the time is we'd leave voicemails for each other rather than emails. I didn't even know how to use a computer. Probably I learned a couple years ago. But anyhow, but then we'd leave voicemails. So I said, well, what should we name it? And he said, well, I'd like something with 3 letters. So I started to think about it, and I came up with this great idea. I said, well, how about if we had something, we started out A for, and we could use advanced, and then I for inhalation. And then I said, what would be really cool is if we could come up with a word that starts with R, because then we could call the company Air, because it was for aerosols, and the aerosols were mostly air. And I spent hours thinking about what could start with R, and I could think of nothing. So I called him up, and I left this voicemail, and I said, okay, this is what we could do: A for advanced, I for inhalation. And then I said, I can't think of anything for R, but if you can, let me know. So I checked my voicemail about an hour later, and he said, Bob, what is this, a test? He said, what's wrong with research? And I thought to myself, Why didn't I think of that? So we ended up calling it Advanced Inhalation Research. And that's actually interesting. David, since that time, he started about 5 companies too. And his 2 latest, well, one of the latest ones, actually amazing. I don't know if you've seen this, but now, and it's not even that high science, but he has aerosolized foods, so including aerosolized caffeine. So you now take these little whiffs, and you can have, it's called AeroShot. I think it's going to be in all these CVS stores next month. And you can have, and actually for me, he made aerosolized chocolate because I like that. But there's all kinds of things. So I have them in, but it's amazing. It's 0 calorie, and you get the thing. So, but it's a lot of fun. And he's come up with more and more interesting innovations. But that was actually a great way of starting out with the naming.
So if you guys were starting now, we've got some students who are probably thinking about grad school or maybe in chemistry now, and they're thinking, now what is the next big fields that people, so if you were starting over now and you were sort of thinking about, where's the next big challenge, or what are some of the next big challenges, what advice might you give?
Well, I mean, certainly one of the largest out there is that, you could imagine how transformative the planet would be and society would be if energy were almost free. The sun provides 120,000 terawatts of power per year on the planet, and we as a society consume 15. There's 120,000 terawatts inbound, and through fossil fuels and everything we do, we use 15. And you sort of, have the phrase, why do people rob banks? That's where the money's at. That's where the power's at. It's at the sun. And so if you could, and it doesn't seem that far afield. I mean, if we could have better catalysts to convert sunlight to chemical fuels and electricity, that could be transformative for this planet. And we're not that far off. I mean, there's some hurdles there, but it's not. You could see a breakthrough being reported in the next 5 years in that area. That would be a really rich one. I mean, why can't crops grow twice a season instead of once a season? And genetically engineer crops so we could have twice as much food on a productive field. I mean, I think there's some mega things out there between food and energy and water. I mean, Holden talks about solving the world's biggest problems. That's where I would play on all these big problems out there, in energy and clean water and food and healthcare. Those are some obviously really big places to play.
I agree with that. Again, I'm going to focus on medicine since that's what we do. But I should make the point that in medical things, it's complicated between doing things that can be transformative and change the world, and then doing that in a way that's timely enough to make a good business out of it. But nonetheless, the area that I would be most excited about in medicine for future opportunities, and there's a few, but one of them is this whole area of regenerative medicine, that you could someday create new body parts. You could make new cartilage, bone, make new spinal cords. I mean, there's almost no limit to what one might do. And there are no drugs right now to treat any of these diseases. There's quite a bit of work going on it, but it's hard because it's a whole new field. So to try to make these things, there have been some commercial successes and plenty of commercial failures. But I think that if we go over the next 20, 50 years, that area will transform, medicine and create opportunities for people, children through older people, with new treatments that never existed before.
So we got time for maybe one more.
Joe hires some undergraduates in his lab from time to time.
Yeah, I like to hire kids that are motivated and willing to run through walls to make a difference. And I like them to be smart too, but I really like motivated students. And for me, I think the key secret sauce for our laboratory is the fact that we really try to optimize for innovation by thinking about the diversity of our laboratory. Diversity is a fundamental tenet of innovation. You get a lot of different perspectives coming together to solve a problem, And there's nothing more powerful than a high-performing set of individuals that represent a broad experience base, different expertise in the laboratory, different cultural backgrounds. When you grow up with not a lot of resources, you think about problems very differently than you grow up with a lot of resources. And all those perspectives coming together to solve a common problem is a really powerful set of experiences to bring to bear. And I try to optimize for innovation by thinking about diversity as much as I think about ability. And those are two sides of the same coin. And so I like a lot of different perspectives coming to bear on problems.
I think we got time for one or two more questions. Any more out there? So Taylor, don't we have some down below that, can we call those back up or?
What was about environmentally friendly plastics and how you're doing that? What kind of difference from just standard commercial plastics?
Yeah, well, you know, I think the trends are to get away from fossil fuels and try to use agricultural approaches for making plastics is one really rich area. That's challenged, though, too, by the fact that you know, the whole life cycle analysis on plastics is complicated because how you dispose of things properly, you know, you sort of ask a question at the grocery store, paper versus plastic. What do you think is the environmentally friendly way to answer that question, paper versus plastic?
Plastic.
Well, you know, most people don't go there, but you know, if you look around the legislature,
Yeah.
if you disposed of that properly, that would be the more appropriate answer. Because the amount of energy required to make paper is enormous. And so it's a complicated issue.
Okay, well, let's thank Joe and Bob again. Okay, our tradition here is to thank our speakers by letting you know what Andy Warhol would do if he did your portrait.
Thank you very much.
Awesome.
Thank you, guys. That's something for your...
That's great.
I know you got a lot of awards in your office, but we hope that one will make it.
That's great. Thank you very much.
Behind you, there's your picture.
Thank you.